guys, good morning. Welcome back to Let's Talk Agile podcast. I am here with Dhaval Shah, and as always, I meet folks for the podcast on LinkedIn. We got to talking about a lot of things and decided to record this episode on business transformations and business agility because Daval is an expert specifically in this area. And I thought that based on previous podcasts, it would be great to uncover this topic a little bit. So, Daval, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much for inviting me and for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm looking forward to chatting with you and exploring more of these topics. So why don't we start directly with the main question? What is
Okay.
business agility? Because I know way too many folks in agile space that know everything
Sure.
about the development process, but have no idea what business agility actually means.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Alex. So before I talk about business agility, for the viewers at home, it's good to provide an introduction to myself. So I'm Deval. I've worked for some very big brands such as Deloitte and McKinsey. I spent 20 years consulting, a lot of time in Fortune 500 companies, and I spend a lot of my time now with mid-market clients, particularly those who are looking to scale quickly in order to attain market share, grow, and ultimately win in the marketplace. So when you look at business agility as a concept, my broad concern around this topic, this subject, the way it's articulated, is that I don't think it's anything particularly new in terms of a phrase or a narrative. It still very much centers around the phrase agile and agility as its core concept. And so when I spend time with clients, I don't talk about agile or talk about agility. I talk about things such as, well, how do we obtain product market fit? How do we obtain market share? How do we take new products and services to market that help that organization to scale and grow sustainably? Because if you look at every organization is transforming constantly, whether they like it or not, because of market dynamics, because of local market pressures, because of changes in macroeconomic conditions. So if you if you look at the umbrella and I guess the agile ecosystem, and I haven't really figured out a good way to articulate what agile is anymore because you ask 10 people and you get 100 different opinions, and I'm one of those 100 people, right? Well, 10 people who has different opinions around this. I think a better quality to conversation around this is, well, what's the outcome you're trying to work towards, and how do you work backwards from that in order to set up your system of work all the way through from vision to goals, to strategy, to execution, so that a company can succeed. Because I think if you have that type of conversation with organizations at any level, whether it's from an engineer to someone in operations to an executive leader, you're now starting to talk in terms of what organizations actually care around. Organizations don't care so much for Agile or Scrum or Kanban or name framework. They care around the outcome it enables. And I think by and large, we as a broader community have missed a trick on this, and this is why I think there's such an upheaval in the market in this space. We see mass layoffs in particular, and people just reject this notion around what agile is.
The concept of growing market share, the concept of building something new, entering another market, maybe working on some improvement areas like reducing churn, they're not really agile concepts, they're generic business concepts. So, how does the word of agility even fit into this? It seems that we can drop the entire word of agility and say, look, we're just working on business.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to articulate it. So if you listen to anything which Mark Zuckerberg talks about, particularly in his early days of Facebook prior to the rebrand to Meta, I appreciate that he has a mixed reception these days, specifically because of the brand he's associated with. But one of the things I think he articulated really, really well, particularly as Facebook was obtaining product market fit and started to scale, is that he talks about organizations that learn faster win. And what he meant by that is if you're able to go to market quickly, the whole mantra of Facebook in the early days was move fast and break things. What he really meant by that is if they're able to understand what customers really care around, they can then modify the products and services they're offering that they're pushing out to market, use that feedback to then adjust and iterate and incrementally improve so that they achieve their outcomes. And I think if you talk again, if you think about it in those terms, all businesses survive to ultimately grow and make money. That is that's their essence, right? And the only way you can do that is by continuing to adjust and evolve based on who your customers are, what the market is saying, and then what you need to do in order to serve the needs of your customers in those markets.
Completely agree. So it almost seems like the terminology of agility, when you add it to the picture, confuses people execution versus purpose. And
Yes, I think.
maybe that's one of the challenges.
And so much of the conflation around agile is around the name framework. So when almost every conversation I have with someone in engineering, particularly leadership level, is well, agile is 2 week sprints. And so immediately there's conflation between agile and scrum, for example. And we know that's not the case. We know these are disparate things by their very nature. But because scrum has had such a position in the market for 30 years, and because people associate these two things together, when they think about agile, they think around they use stand-ups or they use scrums. They think about story points. They think around user stories. They think around velocity. They think around burn down charts. When you look at this from a more commercial perspective, though, organizations don't care around velocity. They don't care around story points. They don't care around burn down charts. They don't care around the rituals or ceremonies or events that people associate Agile with. And therefore, if you look at Agile adoptions over the past 10 to 15 years, and there's been numerous transformations that organizations have embarked on, by and large, you've had, I think, in most cases, a rebrand of roles. So you've had the classical project manager, scrum master, or project manager, product owner, the adoption of events, ceremonies, rituals, practice methods, whatever you want to call them, but no meaningful change in impact in terms of revenue or cost to serve. And that, therefore, is a big disconnect. So if this adoption of a new way of working isn't translated into something which is material from a balance sheet perspective, whether it's cost to serve or whether it's enable revenue growth, then we're not hitting the mark around things that people care around, which is why you're going to see wave after wave of the next thing coming to market that people go after. So it was Agile first, then it was DevOps. Now it's AI. So we're going to see the hype cycle of organizations going through that. But organizations and leaders in particular still want the same things. They want to grow. They want to grow at the lowest price possible, lowest cost possible. And ultimately, they want to keep their jobs. And they're going to look to things that help them to maintain their position at a leadership team level, maintain their impact and their reputation in market. If Agile's not hitting the mark, which I think by and large it hasn't, and there's a variety of reasons around that, then yes, that's where the issue I see with things like Agile and business agility really come in. So part of this is around a branding exercise or branding issue. Part of this is around an efficacy issue. But I think all these things conflated have led to some of the challenges around adoption, particularly in recent years, that we're now seeing in the wider space.
Yeah, I mean, executives do not care how things get done as long as they get done. They only care when things aren't getting done, and that's what piques their interest, and they immediately want to get their hands dirty trying to correct the problems. But from the business side, you said something interesting. You said that it's the speed of adoption in the organization, the speed of learning, and I almost equate that with athletics because there's an argument what we see in sports as talent is is the speed of learning of a specific skill. So some people learn it really, really well, and other people do not. And that's what we deem talent. Talent is the speed of adopting something. So it's almost like we're building the organization to be more talented with the agility concept, right? So kind of have it learn things quicker and operating faster.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. So we presented a proposal to a client, prospective client earlier this week, and one of the areas that we covered as part of our proposal was addressing what they called their product vision problem.
Hmm.
One of the things they attributed to the the challenge around having a static vision. And for context, as the company which was founded in 2019, a private equity backed, they have scaled 50x in 6 years. They now have 25,000 customers, which covers 0.5 million properties. Without, I don't want to give too many details without giving the prospective clients away. But one of the things we talked about in the conversation earlier this week is that if you have a static vision, it provides an anchor. And the problem with that anchor is that the speed at which organizations are growing and moving, it basically erodes relevance over time. And so what they don't want is to have a fixed position to target a market. What they want to do is to be able to grow and learn as quickly as possible. So when there are new opportunities emerging in markets or opportunities emerging in adjacent markets, they are best placed to exploit that. And a really good example of this is Revolut. So Revolut are phenomenally good at bringing new products and services to market. They also have a very, very strong and strict philosophy around experimentation, placing bets in market. And so the latest bet they're taking in market, bear in mind they're a fintech, is they're going to go into the telephony space and they're going to disrupt Europe. They have a single tariff which is going to be pan-European. I think it's 12.50 a month. So for consumers, they're going to take up market share in a declining market. But the thing is that Revolut have spotted an opportunity. They said, well, we see this opportunity to disrupt the market, and they're going after it. They've done their research, they've tested some concepts. That's what business, if you could really boil it down to its essence, this is what business agility is about. If you look at what the CEO talks about, and look at what the leadership team talk about, they don't talk about agility, they don't talk about business agility. This is just how they do things. And actually, it's just their default state of being. And every organization who wants to win should aspire to operating like that.
I like that. I'm thinking back to the Scrum model a little bit, where the planning, the sort of 3 months in advance of plans that must be realized, this kind of pre-agreed fiction that that's exactly what's going to happen. I almost feel like that's the same part of poor focus because you can't plan 3 months in advance and not have to change something. So in the business sense, you could have a strategic vision, right? But you need to adapt how you're going to get there. And the only reason why Scrum planning worked for like 3 months, 6 months at a time, that worked only on software rewrites when everything was clearly known and you just needed to produce the same in a different stack. And even then, there were
Yeah.
surprises.
Yeah, and the world has changed. And at the end, this is where I think a big challenge around adoption comes in and a huge disconnect between what organizations need versus what actually is supplied from a team and organizational coaching perspective. And a really obvious example to pick up on is prioritization. So there are dozens of prioritization frameworks out there. WSJF, Moscow, CD3, just Rice, Kano. And so pick your poison. There's a different way to do prioritization at a team or even a kind of a feature or capability level. The thing is that 80 to 90% of that prioritization is absolute theatre. And the reason for that is actually what you should be doing is you should be using your strategy to guide the things you're going after. Because if you have a clear strategy which tells you the bets you're placed in the market, that is 90% of your direction. Your strategy informs you the things you're going after and why. And therefore, which feature you build or what thing you do in service of that strategy becomes largely irrelevant. And again, it comes down from my perspective, from my lived experience. There's a huge disconnect between the strategy and the vision being the key thing, and actually understand how my business makes money. Because if more agile practitioners, I'll be very, very blunt about this, if more agile practitioners focus around how organizations make money, they would have a better quality conversation around the things that actually matter, which is strategy, and then translating that into, well, how do we then execute as quickly as possible against this strategy so we can test it in market.
Mhm.
And the thing around speed in particular, and it's a fascinating conversation and discussion that is particularly in the agile community. There's a lot of what I call scorn around this. It's almost like if you prioritize speed, it's at the detriment to everything else. And it's like you can have speed and you can have speed and have quality. quality is an enabler to going fast. For example, it's not a dichotomy. It's not if you index on one, then you have to compromise the other. It's all these things are true. It's just you need to bake in excellence at how you're working, technical excellence, deployment excellence. All these things together actually enable you to go really, really quick. And yet, it seems to be if you go faster though, that means obviously you're going to be introducing technical debt, architectural debt. It's like, dude, I used to build systems. I was doing CI and CD back in 2008, where cloud was still very, very nascent. I was doing Hudson. I was doing trunk-based development back in 2008, 2009. None of this stuff is particularly new, but it seems like you focus on one thing, it always has to be at the expense of something else. It's like, no, there are plenty of companies who do this well. And guess what? Those are companies who have 10x the growth over the last 2, 3 years. And AI is only going to make that more visceral and more apparent as companies who succeed are going off these things.
Yeah, you remind me. I did the same thing, worked in Hudson, worked in Jenkins. I remember those days. But you reminded me of a great joke. They told us to move fast, so we launched without QA. Yeah, I think there's always a trade-off. You got to know why you want to go fast. Like for example, since I started operating in startups, going fast means you need to be the first. And it's okay if things aren't perfect because you're trying to build something new, especially if you're in the blue ocean. Being the first to enter the market wins you a lot of accolades even if your software is not perfect because you're the one creating the initial vision. However, there's still stories of companies being first and failing, like Meerkat Periscope, and there's a whole bunch of others I can't think of right now, but like Zoom, right? It was a late player behind everything else that existed. Who talks about WebEx right now, right? So there are things where moving fast is not advantageous, but most often it is.
Yeah, so much of this is down to context and nuance. So here is a conversation from earlier the week I had with some agile practitioners, and it was in relation to an early stage startup. And someone was going to work with the CEO, and they did some work with them. They said, but they're not the right fit. And one of their critiques around the CEO and their organization was that they don't care about things such as scalar architecture or architectural patterns or validation of outcomes or things of that nature. And the list was quite exhaustive. I thought, yeah, but this startup probably has 9 to 12 months worth of funding, and therefore the only thing that
Is
matters is
money.
product market fit. Because if they don't have product market fit, none of all the things you've critiqued that organization about matter because they won't be alive in a year's time. And again, if you think about it in that regard, yeah, if I've got a runway of 9 to 12 months, I will do everything I can possible to validate in order to obtain a tranche of funding to extend my runway.
I like that. When I started running startups, my first mentor, basically, he was the angel investor that invested into us early. The first thing he told me is, Alex, number one rule of startups: do not run out of money. And I remember that to that day. True, yeah, you're not going to work on certificates if you don't have enough, right? Or let's say quality to the great extent, or investing heavily into it in support, in service. If you're, going against the timeline of, hey, if I'm not selling, I'm done, right? Then all
Yeah.
of the effort is going to be only on selling and building whatever sells. It's just the way the cookie crumbles. Unfortunately, we don't have unlimited resources everywhere. And I think people do miss that it doesn't matter what size of the business, it's still the same problem. It's only much larger. And only like very, very large businesses, they have the luxury of having so many different things in different areas that they have diversified their risk across the board and can then take on some strategic uh, initiatives, I guess, to improve their own operations, to cover the risks, etc.
Yeah, and then if you think about this then philosophy around the agile community and then what business agility could be, for me, it's around solving problems. But the reason I got into the consulting space close to 20 years ago, and the reason I've still remained in the consulting space, is that fundamentally, When I talk around helping organizations deliver value faster, what I really talk about is helping them to solve problems faster that enables them to deliver value faster. Because that is a prerequisite to be them to be able, to organizations to be able to do that in a consistent fashion. And so organizations which have gone from absolutely nothing to a 500 person organization, I know co-founders in the space who've done that. It's absolute chaos internally. I know these founders well. They're some of them are good friends of mine, and they'll say to me, "It's like Dhaval, it's absolute chaos." And it's like, yeah, but this is a good problem to solve. Your Series C, your Series D. So you're looking to IPO next. You're looking to ultimately get your payday and buy an island in the Caribbean. But it's a different set of problems with a company which might be at the seed stage. And it's like, to echo a conversation I had with a friend a couple of weeks ago in a pub, is like, our position is defensible. I need to do something with AI. I need to do something. We've got a runway of funding for the next 12 months. But I know that if I don't do something related to AI in this space, someone's going to eat our breakfast and that's it. We're done. Absolutely cooked.
Yeah, this
And
is
it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And then look, if you look at them from a guidance and advice perspective, well, I'll give this person, I'm not going to name names, if I give person one, who's a seed, kind of the founder who's at seed stage, versus the second founder, who is Series C, the advice and the problems that are going to be solving will be very, very different. But it's not going to be, you need to have these ceremonies or events in place. It's going to be, right, okay, well, how do you accelerate this? How do you solve for this? And this is where we can then bring the umbrella of Agile, whatever you want to call it these days, bring that to bear in order to serve the outcomes of the business trying to go after. It's a very different conversation.
yeah, the whole AI argument, hey, we got to build something with AI is the one that ticks me off. Forget about AI. AI is the solution. Figure out the
Mm,
problem. Like, what is it that you want to do? And I like to revert to Marty Kagan's product operating model a little bit. He talks about product, not a business, but in terms of the product and how you evaluate the product, but you state the goal, you answer the questions of why this goal, why now, why is it important to you. You try to state the definition of what you're trying to achieve for the product. So what you're referring to is about the same thing, but at the business level. So if the business was a product, you would probably do exactly the same thing.
yeah, I think what I like about Martin his work is he's very clear that this thinking is not it's not net new. It's been around at least for the last 2 decades. He's been a very strong advocate for operating and working in a different way. What occurs to me when looking at his work and reflects on it, in particular over the last couple of years, where I think there's much more focus in the market, is the reposition of product management, particularly in a digital era, and the importance of this. Then also the struggles that function, or that, I guess, that industry wholesale has had in terms of recognition, in terms of viability and feasibility. And just unpacking this as we go through this conversation, the thing that I think has shifted both for product and also technology or engineering is that these things are much more commercial in nature than they used to be,
Mhm.
simply because of the pace at which markets are evolving and organizations are having to react in order to still stay relevant. And so organizations who aren't able to continue to operate quickly at speed with a level of grace and agility, that's where the challenges occur. And really, that you can only operate in that way if you do have an operating model which supports that, whether it's anchored by process or whether it's not. Maybe again, if you look at Kagan, what he says around process, he said, look, large organizations, they largely don't want process to be in place because of the impact it could have on their ability to do things. My critique of that is, well, sure, that's the thing. Actually, process based around principles will support that, the ability to learn quickly and go faster. But by and large, actually, what you've seen is that people get lost in the rituals, the ceremonies, the events. They'll complain. All teams will complain about having 15, 20 hours a week worth of meetings. It's not a it's not a kind of throwing the shade against things like Scrum, but Scrum teams in particular, for whatever reason, they seem to have this complaint which surfaces more often than not. And it's a tired argument to say, well, it's the adoption of Scrum that's the issue, or organizations aren't adopting Scrum. It's like, well, if we're having that conversation after 30 years, because Scrum came into prominence in 1995, it's the wrong conversation to be having. And therefore, that's why Scrum Masters, by and large, are not having roles in organizations anymore. They're being substituted for more delivery focused roles. Like, I entirely get it. I entirely get it.
Well, execution is what Agile is all about. It's about delivery and execution. I always get into this argument about product management evolving out of Agile. There's always this set of folks that go, no, product management existed before Agile came about. And I'm like, yeah, by name, but it was a totally different discipline. It was all about branding and marketing. It wasn't about building digital products. It wasn't about, goal-based product operating models. That came out of the discussion within Agile. And so what we're looking at right now from the product management perspective, that is still a relatively new discipline that is evolving. And now we have this sort of bigger brother, or sort of smaller brother outgrowing the bigger brother, which is Agile as a delivery mechanism versus product management as a product operating model that's focused on the outcomes.
It's a really good point you raise there because I see multiple different positions around what project management is and isn't. And today's conversation isn't necessarily around that. The point you make, Alex, though, around product management evolving particularly out of agile ways of working, I think is a really relevant one because what product management is trying to direct the conversation around it is around impacts, around outcomes in markets, and the treatment. I think particularly around mains ways of working, and particular Scrum, less safe. There hasn't necessarily been that focus. I remember even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, actually, when you talk to organizations and teams around the need for discovery, there's a case of, well, that's an increased time to market. Yeah, that's not something we should be focusing on. But to your point, if you build a feature or capability which isn't used by the ultimate end consumer, you've spent tens of thousands, or probably hundreds of thousands of dollars investing in something which isn't going to have a net return from a cost perspective or revenue perspective. Not only that, you've probably got an opportunity cost around around something which would have had impacts in market.
I would qualify different types of return. There is a return that is in the monetary form, right? Through subscriptions, whatever user bases, whatever eventually grows your market share. But then there's also return when you're building something that's basically marketing. That's your footprint, that's your visibility. I've previously in my startups, I've built features that would show us off as the market leaders because we would do something really, really drastically different. And we knew that adopting something like that was a far shot and it never played out in a big picture for various reasons. Like an example, in my insurtech startup, we were the first live streaming with infrared technology for insurance business.
Oh wow.
And there was a device that came out, an Android device, and we partnered with a company that was producing it that had the infrared camera built in, and we wanted to be the first to integrate with it. It worked great from the marketing because we were like, hey, we're the only ones that have it. And it was good to show off as a market leader, but we knew that it wasn't going to be a product line long term that we needed to support. So one of those things is something that, is an example of more of a social marketing leverage, right? So the value is not monetary, but it's slightly different. Sometimes you have to build features for that.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to what we're trying to solve for, and then what's the vision, and then what's your strategy to work towards that vision. And that could be a slightly longer term strategy. This is what we're going after, and this is the time horizon. You can have a tiered strategy, which is we're going to make a play in market, and it's going to be marketing led, and that enables us to do something off the back of that. Again, that provides a direction and focus for the organization. And if you then look at this as a collection of things intertwined, ultimately what you really want to have is alignment and enablement across the organization. So you want to have that alignment from the top of the house all the way down to what people are building. And yes, there have been efforts, there have been attempts to try to enable that alignment to lean portfolio management is a practice, which I think by and large has some efficacy and success in this space. But again, the gap for me and the critique I often find myself making is that, well, what is it you're trying to achieve? Is because often what I'll see LPM or lean portfolio management relegated to is, well, we have an OKR, and therefore I'm going to do some stuff against an OKR. But OKRs are just a very short term thing typically. It's like a quarter's worth of work. What's your OKR an expression of? Which again is your strategy. And so if you bring all these things together, it's like these little sticking plasters. An OKR is not replacing the strategy, it's expression. Agile's not replacing for execution, it's a way of executing. But because people don't understand these things and they don't understand it in terms that people who aren't familiar with this concept understand, then you have this friction. But actually, these concepts are relatively simple. How do I build stuff in an effective, efficient way? Have cross-functional teams. Okay, how do I get out to market as quick as possible? Align teams across the value chain or different stakeholders across the value chain so that you get your operational sign-off, they get the training manuals in place, you get legal review, you get compliance review, go to market, get some feedback. What have you learned? This metric's moved, great, we're on the right track, build some more. Or actually, we're not moving the needle in this area. Right, what have you learned? Probably kill that bet, do something else in relation to our strategy. When you put it down, when you distill it down to those terms, you don't need to talk about agile, you just need to talk about a way of working which is efficient and effective. People buy into that because it's simple. It's in language they understand. Everything else, I think it's artificial complexity and introduced complexity to to give people relevance.
I like that artificial complexity. I love that term. There's something that comes to mind when you're saying, the artificial complexity and OKRs. I think people use OKRs wrong. They expect to move the needle really quickly, but OKRs is a lagging indicator. You have to invest and you have to wait. And the question is, how long do you wait to see the OKR move? And that one nobody gets right because usually by the time the execution initiative of that OKR is done, people stop monitoring the actual KR. So it's very interesting because of the short attention span. But I want to ask you a different question.
Sure.
How do you tell a company with good business agility from a company without a good business agility or that has no business agility?
There's a really simple test you can apply. Ask any engineer in any team what strategy the organization is, and a company which has business agility, an engineer will be able to answer that. In fact, any person within that organization should be able to express what the strategy of the company is. Because if they can, it means a strategy is well understood and is articulated and it's been communicated.
Interesting. But I can explain the strategy. I can dissipate that information, hold the big events and things like that,
Hmm.
and probably support that vision through the middle managers. However,
Yes.
when asked to do something, right, or change in the direction, the company can't move. That would counter the definition of the business agility, right? So having strategy doesn't mean that you're agile. It just means that you have a current goal in mind.
The reason I talked about the expression of strategy being so important to that conversation is that if people understand strategy, they know what they're executing in service of. And so there is a causal link between expression of strategy and execution against it. And
Oh,
then organizations who are great at this, there is that very strong alignment between strategy and execution. And therefore they go after the right things organically.
I see what you're
And
saying.
yes, in most organizations, if you ask an engineer or someone in operations what strategy is, they won't be able to express it. And therefore it's almost irrelevant what they're working on because they don't know what they're doing. It's to change direction becomes compromised because why am I changing? Why am I changing direction? Whereas if you know what your strategy is, It's like, okay, well, then you have the scaffolding and the boundaries for autonomous teams to work with. It's like, okay, here's my construct. I can be self-managed or self-organizing within this construct, but I know I need to play in this lane because this is what our strategy tells us to focus on. It doesn't tell us to focus on here, it doesn't tell us to focus on here, it tells us to focus on here. And we know everything we're doing, everything we're funded against is in relation to this higher order problem that we're solving for. And that's where teams, that's where value chains become autonomous. That's where they start to become self-managing because it's really, really clear of the 500 things they can go after, it's these three things. And they don't have this theatre around 50 or 100 OKRs. It's like, no, we're going to measure these three things, these five things. It's super clear.
Yeah,
And that is where organizations have to have that focus to say, look, we're going to go after these things because this is what we're going after. This is what we're going after aggressively. And organizations who do this well in the markets they play in, they're going to go after slices of the market and going to win the market. And they will acknowledge they're leaving money on the table in other areas of that marketplace. And that's cool for them because they don't want to try and be whole of market. When organizations start to try and become whole of market, all of markets, then their offering gets diluted. And guess what? Their ability to acquire, activate, retain customers becomes compromised and their growth slows.
yeah, I see what you're saying. If you know the purpose, you know where you fit within that purpose, and you know your role and
Yes.
your contribution and why you're doing what you're doing, in which case you even psychologically have a more motivation because you know that you might be a small cog in a machine, but you know your role and what you have to do. I like that. That's pretty good. So I wanted to ask you a few more questions. Pivoting. Is
Let's
pivoting
go.
a business agility concept? Obviously, pivoting is more of startups, and a lot of startups pivot as a way to survive. Some companies pivoted three, four times, and we know a lot of them. YouTube was a dating site. Fi was it was guys that built a website to sell ski equipment, and then eventually figured out that people wanted an internet store. There's companies that pivot all the time. Some pivot a few times, but is that really business agility, or how would you call that?
I think I was going to say it's the cost of doing business. I think it's the reality of doing business. Organizations who need to pivot only need to do that because what they're doing right now isn't working. And so if an organization loses product market fit, and that can happen. I'm just trying to think of
Or
companies who
maybe
might be struggling this way.
I don't think, well, some organizations lose product market fit. Others find a bigger opportunity elsewhere. And some
Yes.
simply do not create product market fit. They had some signals that were positive, but then realized there's not enough depth, scale, or speed. And so for survival, they've figured out there is another way.
I think it's a lot easier to pivot or to change direction, particularly if you're smaller scale. I think as you grow, I think once you get there's no hard numbers around. So I think once you get above 1,000 people, the ability to change direction becomes exponentially more challenging. Look, if you need to do that, again, the conversation, the narrative isn't going to be around business agility. It's around business survival or business opportunity. And again, like the thing we're not optimizing for is agility. The thing we're optimizing for is growth or staying relevant in the industry or the market that you're operating in. And if it the key to this is then bringing back the context of the conversation to what people really, really care around.
Interesting.
Uh,
So if I hear you correctly, what you are saying is that if a different goal through business agility is determined, pivot is a tool that can be applied to get there.
yes, yes. But even if you pivot, you still need to improve the viability and efficacy in the thing you're pivoting towards. And this is where placing bets in the market, going after things, testing and learning, this is where these concepts become very, very important. But again, the whole dialogue and discourse around business agility and the word agility at the boardroom level, they're not talking about agility, they're talking about, right, okay, How do we know that if we're going to take this punt in the market, this bet, that this is going to pay off? Like, what information do we have? What does our gut feel tell us from experience that we're going to be right? Because if they get this wrong, this is where organizations will hemorrhage staff, and they'll cut headcount by 60, 70%. This is where revenue starts to fall off a cliff. This is where losses start to mount. And these are real things. And that's the thing. This is not some artificial set of platitudes. You get this wrong and real lives of impacts. And these are the likes of you and I. And we have families, we have mortgages, we have bills to pay. This is real stuff.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question since you've been doing a lot of these. Can you share a disaster story? Like business transformation or business agility that simply didn't work and what that looked like. And then contrast that with a success story. I'd be very interesting to learn, and I'm sure our viewers as well, like what does that look like? Sort of your war stories, if you will.
Yeah, I've got a really good one, and it's certainly a disaster. So many years ago, towards I think it was 2018, 2019, I engaged with Roche Pharmaceuticals. So in the US, they're called Genentech, but they are the same entity. I think they're top six globally in terms of pharma manufacturers in the world. And I worked with not a team in IT or within the business. I worked with a drug development team. So these are clinical scientists,
Hmm.
and we were working on a molecule or a drug for Alzheimer's. And this drug is called gantenerumab. And so, without going into the particular details of this molecule, it was an anti-amyloid strategy. So, if you are familiar with Alzheimer's, the theory behind Alzheimer's and what causes it to occur as a phenomenon, it's the buildup of proteins or plaques within the brain between neurons. And the theory or the hypothesis is that if you get rid of these buildup of plaques or proteins, then communication between these neurons is no longer inhibited, and therefore there's not a loss of
Hmm.
cognitive there's no cognitive decline. Anyway, I started working with this team, and the run rate is about $100 million a year. So it's a serious money to spend in. Kind of average bench to bed life cycle is about 10 years. The failure rate is incredibly high. So this team or these series of clinical teams are really interested around how to apply agile and lean techniques to accelerate drug delivery, et cetera, et cetera. And this is pre-COVID, right? So this has a huge amount of relevance. I still remember when we've come up to a beautiful site in Switzerland. This town was called Aldelboden. It's a picturesque Swiss town with the Alps in the background, etc., etc. And I turn up to this beautiful hotel, go into a conference room, and on the news is a story around a competitor, and the competitor is called Biogen, and they had a molecule called aducanumab. And the reason why this is important is because Biogen paused phase three clinical trials for their drug. And the reason they paused phase three clinical trials, which is the last stage before going for approval with the regulatory body, is because, to put it into very simple terms, they didn't believe their drug was effective. And the way their drug worked was exactly the same as the molecule that Roche had developed. The thing to have done at that point would have been to just pause proceedings and take a step back, because you have 30 incredibly intelligent clinical scientists who have dedicated most of their professional working career to the development of this molecule and said, right, maybe this is not the right time to start talking about agile and lean ways of working. What I did do, though, instead, much to my yeah, much to my learning posthumously, was like we plowed ahead and we still talk about how to do things, how to obtain fast feedback, etc., etc. And as you can imagine, all of this, it went down like a lead balloon, because people they weren't in the right frame of mind to learn. They were absolutely terrified that their whole careers were effectively going to go down to dust, and people talking around finding a new job, leaving the company, having to find something else to do, type of thing. I was entirely the wrong space to be talking about these
And
concepts.
we're on time too, right? So if you know that that medication will not come to fruition because a competitor hit the roadblock, and you're probably going to get
Yes,
stuck with yours as well. Those are sunk costs. So there's no sense improving your process of developing if what you're building is already obsolete.
100%. And
But the
this
inertia,
is,
big companies are known for that inertia, right? Oh, we know, we heard, but we still, moving in that direction. Like they really struggle making the change because they're so focused on quote unquote busy productivity. They need to plan the resources. They can't have their people sit. But if all they did is like send their people, home on vacation for a week and realign what they wanted to do, they could have saved themselves a lot more money and had the folks be extremely happy.
yeah. And so the lesson for me, and this is one of the sharpest lessons I've learned throughout my career, is that a lot of this comes down ultimately to timing and circumstance. And so I use that horrendous experience because we parted, I would say, on unfriendly terms based on the work that I did. And it was, I take accountability for not recognizing the situation, not recognizing the impacts on people, and trying just continue to push ahead. I've used that experience to become much better as a practitioner, but also better at reading the situation, reading the room, and then also understanding, okay, well, this has happened. How about we just take a step back and just reflect on what's going on, and then use that to understand where we want to go. And so much of my work, particularly at leadership level, because running an organization is incredibly challenging for a variety of reasons. So much of my work these days is around understanding people, understanding timing, intent, communication, what's being said, what's not being said. And that I've become much more business focused as a result, much more commercially focused. But then married that with emotional intelligence. So I've had to learn the hard way the importance of strategy. If I had to learn the importance of understanding how a business makes money.
So let's
I need those things proof.
so let's contrast that with the Dhaval 2.0 improved and the success story.
So it's interesting actually because I have a really strong success story before that, and I think almost it was that experience that's blinded me to the fact that I can't do everything I touch doesn't turn necessary to gold. I don't have necessarily in my as touch. So
Oh, I think
I
anybody
worked
that says
for
that is very arrogant, because
yes,
we are always subject to forces outside of our control.
yes,
Like
100%.
when I had my video startup in insurance, we started with Google Glass, and we know how that went. So many startups
Mm,
failed because the technology was either not there or just was cut out from underneath of them. And there were so many things where just things are outside your control. You're building you're building a product, then something is released by one of the, giants, Google's, Facebook's, etc., and they just conquer the world and you're stuck without a market. So things always happen, unfortunately. The best we could do is have faith.
yeah, I agree. So if we can contrast that with a success story, so there is a retailer in the UK called Sainsbury's, 6 billion market cap. I started working with them in 2017. And when I started working, I actually started working with their finance team. And so my role was around portfolio management and looking at around how they invested their money. And so across a population of about 1,500 people in the digital and technology department, they spent roughly 150 million pounds, which is probably circa $200 million a year, on capital investment. Now, up until this point in time, this part of the organization was loss making. It wasn't considered to be a strategic partner to the business. Their investment strategy was disjointed. If you asked the leader what the strategy was, they couldn't tell you. Their investment process was they had a weekly meeting where the heads of technology and the CIO would sit in a room for an hour and people would come in and effectively a Dragon's Den style pitch of, okay, I'm going to ask for some money. How much, sir? It's very Oliver Twist-esque. And they did this once a year, 50 times a year. And so roughly 300 to 400 investment papers a year were presented for this money with no lines of strategy, no real quantification of benefits, and in a language that the rest of the organization didn't understand. And so if you ask anyone around this process, they said, well, I don't see the value in it. It's very time consuming. There's no connection to benefits. It's very technologically focused. And so there was a burning platform to change this. And so what we did, so as a strategy and planning team, as a finance team, is we redesigned the entire experience around that. And so this is, I think they moved to an AKR based system eventually. But what we say is, look, well, let's just focus on the outcomes for a quarter. We're not going to talk around the plan aspect, but offer some money and ask what outcomes you're going to enable, and then how you're going to measure the impact of this. And without going into too much discourse around the benefits, throughput increased by 30% in year one. MPV, which is an acronym which stands for net present value,
Mm-hmm.
increased by 134 million in year one. And that area of the business became profitable for the first time. But more importantly, the conversation that part of the business had with the rest of the organization became much more strategic in nature because they're now talking about the outcomes that the retailer was trying to work towards. I spoke to a few people after that engagement ended, and he said that piece of work was one of the most transformational in the history of the organization. And it's simply because they reframed how they wanted to solve for that problem, which is we want to stop talking about building things to start to focus around outcomes. And it's a very subtle change when you start to educate people around these things and measure how you measure impact around these things because it has a cascading effect. So what product managers now start to become more commensurate with and much more focused around is all we don't have a baseline to measure to assess impacts in markets. So how do we establish a baseline so we can look at how we're changing and how we're affecting the market, whether it's I know we're moving the needle in this metric or moving down in this area. And so the whole conversation around this changed. And the process became a lot more lightweight. People actually understood what they're working in service of. And this was at scale.
Yeah, beautiful story. I think a lot of companies fail to understand where they make their money and where they're
Mm,
just losing money, like burning it. Like
yes.
there's an example in one of the companies where I worked where there was an initiative to build an internal tooling that had nothing to do with the business. They just happened to implement it, come across. There was some idea from some engineer, and they essentially built out an internal database, right? Their own database, which they didn't need to because the company was not in the business of databases. And because of the sunk costs, the folks were afraid of, letting it go, but it served no purpose. And this group kept insisting on integrating their own internal database to a lot of technical teams. But obviously, with the state of all the databases right now, it just didn't make any sense. Why run something on your own when you can just buy something that's a lot cheaper and better quality and much more predictable from operation, scalable, etc. So it was an obvious line item to cut from the expenditures. However, it took some time to even convince some people to do it, which is right lack of business agility. Sometimes you know if it's wrong, so just got to make that call.
And this drives all sorts of what appears from the outside to be absolutely insane behavior. So I've seen particularly large organizations create shadow IT organizations
Yep.
because you've got effectively what they consider to be a rogue technology department doing things which don't make any sense. They said, well, look, rather than fund that rogue technology department, we're going to create our own one with 10 to 20 people who will get things done three times as fast at course of the cost
Yeah.
base.
Well,
And I have line of sight around what's going on.
it's the problem of, hey, if we're not going to go through them, we're going to go around them, right? I have one very interesting question for you.
Sure.
If you could ban one buzzword from business agility ecosystem, what would it be?
I think if we just ban the word agile, I think if we just ban that as a term, we would be in a much better position to have very simple conversations. Or if I could ban any discussion around name frameworks, whether it's Scrum or Kanban or less, or Nexus. I'm sure I've missed a few. DSDM, etc., etc. And we just talked in very simple, plain terms around ways of working and operating models and how to get stuff done. My hypothesis is that the community associates themselves with being an agile practitioner would have far more relevance and have far more impact in the organizations they work in. Because you think around, to segue to what Capital One did just over, I think it's over a year ago now, they got rid of all of the agile practitioners. Anyone who has agile in their job title, they got rid of. Some of them were rehired into other roles. They said, look, this by and large is now a way of working. How much of that is true? It's unclear. I'm talking from the outside in, so I don't have that internal perspective. But the problems they're now trying to solve are different, and actually the focus around what they're trying to do is different as well. So why talk about something which is as a as a set of A principles great, but still is from an era which is not 2025.
Yeah,
The manifesto for Agile Software Development is 2001, Scrum's 1995, the new product development game is 1986, stuff related to TPS predates all of that. Cool, that's great. All of that stuff is really, really important, but let's go out and solve problems. But you don't need to talk in terms of Agile and Lean to be able to do that.
yeah, I kind of feel that the titles we had about 20 years ago, they were a little bit more deliberate in terms of what somebody was doing. A consultant,
Mm.
for example, right? So business consultant, not business agility coach. And it was obvious this is the person that consults around the business. The whole terminology of Scrum Master versus Scrum or Agile Coach, to me, it sounds not important at the leadership level. It sounds like it's optional. It sounds like, hey, we could do this if we have extra funding, but it's the first thing that's going to be cut because of just the way it sounds. It doesn't sound like there is any weight behind it. I don't have a name to convert to, but I think the engineering manager, to be honest, if they are properly educated and know the space and know not to abuse their superiority with a title, they can build a great team on their own, right? Or a tech lead could, depending on how you build the teams. So I think skill wise, you can get that skill internally, and that's probably why these roles as a standalone no longer carry that same weight, at least not in the US. And that's interesting. I think terminology we could always tighten up on.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. So I've played most roles in my career, from being a full stack engineer to someone who does products or product management, to someone who does engineering management, to someone who has been a delivery lead or scrum master, through to running transformations. And if you look at the relevance of a job title, if I was to look at, and this is quite a crude analogy, but let's play this through. If I was to look at a list of 200 names or 200 role titles related to people, I understand what a product manager does. I understand what an engineering manager does. As soon as I start to see Scrum Master, okay, fine. Agile coach, enterprise agile coach is like these. If you try and explain these things, these job titles to people who aren't necessarily familiar with the industry, you could almost argue that they're made up. I think if you went, there's a show. I think it's sort of. I'm not sure if it's still run in the US. Certainly not run in the UK anymore. Who wants to be a millionaire?
Yeah.
And so we had Chris Tarrant in the UK, I believe, and you get the four questions. I think if you ask ask a contestant which of these are made up job title, and one of the things was the Scrum Master or Agile Coach or Enterprise Agile Coach against three other job titles, I'm convinced, and I'd put good money on this, I'm convinced that they would say that a Scrum Master, an Agile Coach, or an Enterprise Agile Coach is a made up job title,
Yeah.
because it just seems so funky related compared to actually what you see in industry, like compared to mainstream roles.
Well, I actually have a slightly different way of arriving to those things. And this is from my experience working in startups and running startups. So let's say I have a small team and the team is about, 5, 6 people. Will I ever hire a scrum master? Absolutely not. Why would I? I have even if my team is totally dysfunctional, I'd rather jump into micromanagement at that level because I'm simply strapped for cash. And again, I don't want to spend more on a perfect development process, right? I need results and I need sales and I need customers and users, and that's my focus, not a perfect and happy feel and, a perfect retrospective. I don't really care about that. Now, let's say I grow to about 15 people. Is my model going to change? Absolutely not. No, it's still the same thing. So, and then the concept that I usually talk to large enterprises about is the model of a startup within the enterprise. Because as soon as you have the product manager that actually knows what they're doing, they need the freedom to operate within the level, the budget, and give them a good engineering team and a marketing team, and then have them show you what they can do. That's the model that worked for some. Obviously, not all organizations function that way, but if you can decouple that small team with all that they need out of that enterprise and give them the financial backing of an enterprise, that can flourish really, really well in the right environment. Obviously, not everybody's comfortable, having these small business units, independent and autonomous. But in that concept, I almost always feel that unless delivery and execution is a huge problem, it's doubtfully that they will hire Scrum Masters and Agile coaches. I think it's more of an enterprise global ability to improve the operations where they go and say, okay, fine, we'll let people hire because they need to learn. But but it's not a role that somebody's going to sustain forever and ever, you know?
No, I think again, largely from lived experience and what I've observed, I feel like people will get very comfortable in a job, and I make the distinction between a job and a role. So someone can play multiple roles concurrently. So you can be an engineering manager and also enable agility or flow or whatever concepts you want to apply as part of your role. So whenever I used to lead teams or transformations, I wouldn't necessarily associate myself as an agile coach or a coach per se. I have an executive coaching background. That's one of the disciplines I pull upon. But ultimately, I'm here to serve the purpose of the business. So I call myself a business consultant or product or delivery consultant because actually that's the thing I'm trying to optimize for. I think at scale, these roles are relevant, but again, you have to demonstrate impact. You have to demonstrate the ability to make a positive change to that ecosystem. Because if you can't do that, then no amount of posturing or making excuses around lack of leadership or challenging the ecosystem or operating system is going to cut it. Like you're there to do a specific thing, which is to improve time to market or to improve productivity or to improve alignment. Go after that thing and then own it
Yeah.
and be accountable for it.
Yeah, to put it in the
And
business agility sense, right? If your goal is to improve delivery and execution, one of the solutions could be to onboard a set of Scrum Masters and Agile coaches to help the teams get there, right? So to put it in that.
yes,
Awesome. Well, Deval, good conversation. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for your insights and feedback. And again, thanks for joining in. This was a lot of fun. Thanks.
yeah, I appreciate that. And I think just as a takeaway comment and remark, I think there's still a place for the agile community, both present day and also into the future. The thing that I invite people to consider is think around in the context they're operating in, how they can understand more around ultimately how that organization functions. Because if they can just step away from particularly lower level concerns and think at a slightly higher level, the ability to influence others and have impacts becomes magnified. But if you continue to focus around events and ceremonies and artifacts and what I think the mainstream agile space has focused on for so long, that's going to have that's going to limit your ability to be effective. And it's an uncomfortable truth, but it's a truth that needs to be shared because I think people are good. And I think a lot of people have come into this space because they have compassion for others.
Mhm.
And I also have compassion for others, but there are ways to demonstrate that compassion. And that's through by delivering impact, actually having a positive impact on the environments they work within and affecting change in that way.
I love it. Sort of like the connect the dots, right?
Connect the dots and get stuff done.
Yeah.
Solve problems.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Dhaval. Really, really great podcast. Hey guys, to you watching online, if you are trying to get in touch with Dhaval, I will share his contact on the podcast. So comments below and reach out if you have any questions. Dhaval is always contributing. So be sure to ping him, connect with him on LinkedIn. He's definitely somebody you want to stay in contact with.
Thank you.